Well, the Albanese government, as we've just mentioned, is under pressure over these migration numbers and growing concern about Australia's housing, particularly hospitals and infrastructure, and concerns that it simply can't keep up with these numbers. Now, recent protests have put the issue in the spotlight. So how do Australians really feel about this issue? Joining me live is Redbridge Group Director Simon Welsh. Simon, good morning to you as always. How concerned are Australians right now about these migration levels?
Yeah, thanks, Holly. Yeah, look, there's absolutely no doubt that we're picking up in our research, in our groups and in our quantitative research, that the Australians do have concerns about the size of our immigration intake in a context of housing crisis and all those things that you mentioned. But there is some important nuance here. And the first piece around that is that they are equally attuned to politicians that are seen to be politicising the issue, playing games with the issue, and this idea that using it as an excuse to not do other things, particularly on housing. I mean, that's a great example. So we hear a lot from particularly younger cohorts of voters talking about things like, we need to address the systemic problems around housing in terms of, the amount of housing we're building, the tax incentives and so forth that keep young people out of the game. Yes, immigration is part of that story, absolutely, but it's only part of that story. And so there's this consciousness, this sensitivity, that's the word I'm struggling for, this sensitivity to the idea of politicians using it as an excuse to do proper reform on issues like housing or on health and education, in terms of using immigration as an excuse not to properly fund these services. So that's the first thing. And we don't see in Australia, because of that sort of nuance around that, we don't see sort of a broad-based anti-migration movement like you see in the UK or in the US. So, the really staunch anti-migration on principle kind of cohorts tend to be still very much at the fringes. Most Australians are still pro-migration. Yes, we might want to have a discussion about how much migration we take, but there's not this broad-based sort of sense that migration is a net negative for the country. And in part, that's due to migration itself and the changing nature of our suburbs. Our suburbs are far more diverse. I grew up in the western suburbs of Melbourne, and the time I was growing up there was pretty white. It's no longer like that. And so, folk are living side by side with new Australians, and their experience of that is not what, sort of the negative kind of experiences that often get talked about. So there isn't this broad base of anti-migration. Yes, let's have a conversation about whether we need to tune or so forth, but that cannot be excuse for doing other things on these key issues.
Yes, I agree with you there. Some points you've picked up. I mean, a lot of conversations that I'm having with people is that they're often afraid to bring up their concerns about migration levels and where the numbers are at, over fears that they'll be called a racist, or that they shouldn't have or wouldn't have legitimate concerns about migration levels. And I think it's important to be able to have a calm, legitimate, mature debate about migration levels, because the housing problem is a concern. And as you mentioned, it's only part of the problem, but it is still a concern. And the concern I think that a lot of people have, you mentioned there the US and the UK. Yes, Australia isn't at that level yet, but the concern is that potentially we're headed that way. Is that what you're hearing from voters?
Yeah, certainly that idea of people want a calm, mature, sensible discussion about that is absolutely where they're at. And the sort of the critique of that applies on both sides. So, the critique is, we shouldn't run around just labelling everyone racist if they have questions about immigration intakes and its impact right now. But equally, that calm, rational, sensible debate does not look like what we saw on the weekend. So there's sort of equal kind of discomfort with both sides of the edges of that debate. But certainly, as I said, that calm, sensible debate about what is the right level of migration, acknowledging, it, but coming from this mindset that migration is a net positive for this country. It's part of the fabric. It's part of who we have been. That kind of sense is prevalent in our suburbs of major cities and even our regional centres.
Absolutely, Simon. You made some really good points there. I mean, it is time to have a mature conversation about this, but unfortunately, extremists on both sides of this, the fringes of both sides of this conversation, are ruining it to be able to have a mature and calm debate about this legitimate concern that some people have within our country. Simon Welsh, we'll leave it there for today. Thank you.
Thanks, Holly.